I'm John Kramer, and this is Totally 80s. Alright folks, got my stack of comic books. Let's talk the Infinity Gauntlet. And I know the Infinity Gauntlet didn't come out in the 80s, it came out in 91. But I'm not just here to talk Infinity Gauntlet, because I don't just want to give you a synopsis, because that's what Wikipedia is for. I want to give you the backstory of the Infinity Gauntlet, which is why I've got the stack of comic books. But I also don't just want to give you the backstory, I want to give you my backstory, which is why I'm here. So for me, it all began back in 1987. And strangely enough, in the pages of Batman, issue number 414 to be exact. And just to give you an idea of what was going on in Batman at this time, just a year earlier, in issues number 404 through 407, we have Batman Year 1, which is where Frank Miller was giving us a grittier backstory to the Batman. Or in Detective Comics number 575 through 578, we had just finished up Batman Year 2. And a couple of years earlier, in Teen Titans number 44, Dick Grayson had just shed the Robin costume and had become Nightwing, which means that back in the pages of Batman, Jason Todd was now Robin. And in Batman number 408, they gave him a grittier backstory as well. Now, back to number 414. Now, the reason why this was such a landmark issue for me was because this was the first issue where the trio of writer Jim Starlin, penciler Jim Aparo, and inker Mike DiCarlo took over the creative duties for the Batman title. And starting with issue number 414, this was the beginning of my favorite era of Batman comics. In fact, my nephew and I were having a conversation not long ago, and he was asking me, what is my favorite comic book story? And I really didn't have to think very long before I responded with Batman 10 Nights of the Beast, as found in issues number 417 through 420. And my nephew, being all excited, that, hey, it's Batman, who's the villain? And he was expecting it to be, somebody landmark like the Joker, or the Riddler, or maybe even, Bane, even though Bane wasn't around at this time. And, but, like I say, he was expecting someone legendary for, being my favorite comic book story. And I responded, it's the KG Beast. And, who? Yeah, and this is my nephew who had probably never even heard of the KGB, let alone the KG Beast. And he was like, how could it be such a great story when I've never even heard of that villain? And my response was, well, it's because it was written by Jim Starlin. Jim Starlin knows how to write a comic book story, and he is very capable of taking an unknown villain and writing a great story around them. Now, because I loved all these Batman stories so much, it got to the point that if I ever saw the name of Jim Starlin, Jim Aparo, or Mike DiCarlo on any other comic book, I would buy it. Because either of those names guaranteed that it would be a good book. So now I'm going to have to jump out of the 80s again, got to jump up to 1995, because I'm going to talk about a movie from that era just to try and make a point. But the movie was called Crimson Tide, and it starred Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. And it's a submarine film. It takes place post-Cold War, post-KGB. And I have to say, I don't know off the top of my head who the writer was, but I do know that Quentin Tarantino, who was fresh off the success of Pulp Fiction, was called in to liven up the script a bit. Now, they've never actually come out and said what parts Quentin Tarantino wrote, but it's pretty obvious that the scene I'm going to talk about right now is a Quentin Tarantino edition. So the scene begins in the submarine, in the mess hall, and there are two sailors who are having a fight, and they're pushing each other around, and they're ready to start throwing punches. And then somebody steps in between them and breaks it up. And so, one of the sailors, kind of embarrassed by the fight, he storms off. But Denzel Washington, cuts him off and asks him, what's up? And the sailor responds, it's just a difference of opinion that got out of hand. And Denzel then asks, well, what about? And the sailor replies, it's really too silly to talk about. I'd rather just forget about it. And Denzel then retorts, I don't care what you'd rather forget about. Why were you two fighting? And so the sailor explains that, he said that the Jack Kirby Silver Surfer was the only real Silver Surfer, and that the Mobius Silver Surfer was crap. But the other sailor in the fight happened to be a big Mobius fan, and it got out of hand. I pushed him, he pushed me. I lost my head. And so then Denzel has to reprimand him and says, you're a supervisor. This better not happen again, or I'm going to have to write you up. You have to set an example. And then Denzel ends the conversation by reaffirming that everybody who reads comic books knows that Kirby Silver Surfer is the true Silver Surfer. So now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to point out that they're both wrong. Because the true Silver Surfer is actually the one drawn by Ron Lim. Okay, so now we're actually making some progress towards the Infinity Gauntlet, because at least we're talking the Silver Surfer. Now, I have to confess that up to this point in time in my life, in the 80s, I had thought Silver Surfer was probably one of the dumbest characters in comics. He's just some guy flying through outer space on a surfboard. But by the late 80s, Ron Lim had started drawing the title. And so I'd see it up on the comic shop wall, and his art would draw me in, because the way he draws Silver Surfer, just the way he draws the glare, the way he draws the reflection, he looks like he's made of silver. And so one day I actually went up and I pulled it off the wall and I started flipping through it, because this was back in the day before comic shops bagged and boarded everything, so you could actually, flip through the comic. You didn't have to buy it on the cover alone. And the issue I picked up was issue number 37. And I noticed that it was being written by Jim Starlin. And so, like I said earlier, if I ever saw a comic book with the name, Starlin, Aparo, or DiCarlo on it, I would buy it. So I bought issue number 37 and brought it home and read it, and I absolutely loved it. So I went back to the shop to see if they had any other buy any other Silver Surfer comics they had, that hadn't sold yet. Some of the most recent back issues that were still on the wall. And they actually went back to number 34. So I bought them all. Now, little did I realize what was happening here. I had no idea what Jim Starlin had in store. Because first off, I had no idea that issue number 37 was the first reappearance of Drax the Destroyer. And I most certainly didn't know that issue number 34 was the first reappearance of some long-forgotten character, created by Jim Starlin back in the 70s, but that he'd killed off. And issue number 34 is also another example of how Jim Starlin can take an unknown villain and write an amazing story around him. Because issue number 34 is the first reappearance of the villain known as Thanos. Now, in 1990, I had the opportunity to meet Jim Starlin, and I had him sign a number of my comics, including 10 Nights of the Beast, and I had him sign Silver Surfer issue number 37, because this was my gateway drug. This was the issue that started my Silver Surfer addiction. Okay, so now we've introduced Silver Surfer, and now it's almost time to talk the Infinity Gauntlet. But first we have to discuss two issues known as the Thanos Quest. Now, the Thanos Quest is the story where Thanos actually gets the Soul Gems, later known as the Infinity Gems. But unlike the film Infinity War, he didn't get them from Doctor Strange or from Vision's forehead. He got them from characters called the Elders. Now, back when I first took my kids to go see Infinity War, my son leaned over to me, about halfway through the film, which was still a good hour and a half into the film, and asked me if the movie was called Infinity War because that's how long the movie lasted. Because the film is way too long. The filmmakers were trying way too hard to cram way too much information into the film. And I wish the filmmakers would have done what Jim Starlin did in the Thanos quest, which is to set up the story before you actually begin it. That way you can go in strong. That way when Infinity Gauntlet started, we didn't have to set everything up. It was ready to go. And I don't think that the filmmakers needed to make a film called The Thanos Quest, but I think they should have taken advantage of the post-credit scenes to the 6 films prior to Infinity War. And then in each scene, you could see Thanos acquire a new soul gem. And then in the film just before Infinity War, we would see Thanos get the final gem, and then place it in the gauntlet. Maybe the gauntlet glows, and then we'd be set up and ready to go in strong. Instead of having to spend half the film just building up to where we want it to be. But of course, Disney isn't concerned with good storytelling. They're more concerned with special effects and how much money they can possibly milk from the audience. So they're going to drag this out into as many films as they possibly can. Now we can finally talk the Infinity Gauntlet. And yes, on the cover, that is Joe Rubinstein's autograph. He was the inker. So, let's just open to this spread right here, where Mephisto is praising Thanos. And we can see the word God chiseled out of stone. This is when it became apparent to me that I probably had Jim Starlin sign the wrong comic book. Because I probably should have had him sign issue number 34 instead of issue number 37. Drax is cool and all, and I love that he's in Guardians of the Galaxy. But when a character starts getting compared to God, it becomes pretty obvious that he's probably going to amount to something, and the comic he first reappeared in might end up being worth some money. Now let's turn here just a couple of pages to this scene where Silver Surfer comes crashing through Doctor Strange's roof. And this scene is cool enough that they used it in the film. But Disney does not have the rights to Silver Surfer, so they had to use the Hulk instead. Which is actually too bad because Silver Surfer plays a very major role throughout the Infinity Gauntlet. And because he plays such a major role, I had actually wished that the comic had been drawn by Mr. Silver Surfer himself, Ron Lim. But it was actually penciled by George Perez. Now, I have nothing against George Perez because I had become familiar with his work, way back in Teen Titans. For instance, the first appearance of Nightwing. And if we're going to continue bragging about autographs, then yes, that's Marv Wolfman's autograph on the cover of number 44. But just to give you an example of what George Perez can do, let's look at this image of Spider-Man. Because the detail is mind-blowing. Just all the windows in that cityscape. And I have to assume that this was inker Joe Rubinstein's worst nightmare. He probably got this picture and just went, oh my goodness, do I have to ink all those windows in just one frame? So now, let's just turn back one page from that image of Spidey to what I like to refer to as the snap heard round the world. The snap that took out 50% of the Marvel Universe. Now, this wasn't Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was not a comic whose purpose was to eliminate, duplicate characters. So because of which we knew that this change was not going to be permanent. Just like when I saw Infinity War, I didn't fear that Spider-Man and all those other heroes were gone forever. I might be foolish, but I'm not that foolish. And Thanos even clues us in earlier in the comic when he says that any result that displeases me, I can simply reverse. And of course he can. Because if he's powerful enough to destroy 50% of the population, he's also powerful enough to restore 50% of the population. Because he who holds the gauntlet is omnipotent. or shall I say, she who holds the gauntlet. So, let's get back to the comic. Like this scene here, where Trump Tower is being taken out by a tidal wave. Now, I'm not stating whether I'm pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I just think it's funny that he's in the Infinity Gauntlet. Now, in issue number 4, the wish that I had made earlier came true. And if you look at the bottom of this opening page, you'll see that the penciling duties were taken over by none other than Ron Lim. Now what happened here is that George Perez simply ran out of time. He had previously signed on to draw War of the Gods, and he just couldn't fit it all in. And of course he couldn't fit it all in, because if you look at that picture of Spider-Man again, if you're going to draw detail like that, you're going to have to clear your schedule. So anyway, the story now culminates, issue number 6, with Adam Warlock becoming the final possessor of the gauntlet, and Thanos retiring as a gentleman farmer. So after I bought the Infinity Gauntlet, I went back and I bought, Silver Surfer issues number 33 all the way back to number 1. And I noticed in these stories that the writer before Jim Starlin, whose name is Steve Englehart, was already bringing back characters that would later appear in the Infinity Gauntlet. And so, like, for instance, here in issue number 17, we have the Elders of the Universe, the characters who had the soul gems. And down here in the bottom corner, in the box where the UPC code goes, we see Mistress Death. And in issue number 16, we see the return of the soul gems, that would later become the Infinity Gems. And now, back in 2014, I found an interview with Jim Starlin. And the interviewer was asking him, what inspired you to bring back these old characters to then, write the Infinity Gauntlet. And Jim Starlin replies that, well, that was self-defense. I'm not going to say who it was, but there was a writer who wanted to bring Warlock back. And I had just been doing the Silver Surfer series at that point. And they were going to let him do it unless I wanted to do it first. So I did it in self-defense. I wasn't a big fan of this writer's work. So now, I just have to make the assumption that the writer that Jim Starlin is referring to is Steve Englehart. Which means I now have to ask that if Steve Englehart had been allowed to write, his version of what might become the Infinity Gauntlet, and not Jim Starlin, the guy who can take an unknown villain and turn him into something epic, would we be watching it as a feature film some 30 years later? Well, as a Jim Starlin fan, I'd have to say, I think not. So, until next time, I'll just keep on living in the